Find and learn from people who lived it wherever you get podcasts. Search it using all one word. Learn from people who lived it.
Welcome to another episode of Learn from People Who Lived It.
It really boiled down to my childhood, to be honest. So that's what started it for me. I grew up with just a rather unique story. I'm happy to share it with you if you want.
Better sex, more intimacy, more communication, more control over your money, mental toughness, emotional resilience, mindset cultivation. How about creating an environment where your kids feel comfortable to come and talk to you? How about an extraordinary marriage? These are the things that Larry Hagner is leaning into these days, and 100% we are here to hear his story. I'll learn from people who lived it. Hi there, it's Matthew Blades, and I want to thank you for being a part of what we're doing here. If you're brand new to our podcast, I invite you to leave a very kind review and check as many stars as you feel comfortable with. All that stuff helps us grow, and as people discover us, it helps them trust us a little bit more, and of course, I appreciate it. So let's jump in with Larry here and have an incredible conversation that starts with his childhood.
I grew up, with my mom and biological father. They got married in like 1971. I was born in 75. They were married for they were only married for about 9 months after I was born. So after I was born, they went through this really, really, really bad divorce, and they split up. And I think my dad tried to see me, tried to, have visitation, but it didn't pan out too terribly well. And what I mean by that is he left after a while, just stopped trying. And unfortunately, I never knew him. And when I was 4 years old, I actually, my interpretation of what a father was and how they actually came to be was a bit interesting, because I was in preschool. I remember dads coming to pick up their kids. And I remember I didn't have one. And it was no big deal. I didn't really feel like I was missing out on anything. My view of it was moms go out and find dads. And my mom hadn't found our dad yet. And that was fine. I knew she would eventually. That was kind of my view of it. And I'll never forget being 4 years old, and my mom brings home this guy. And my mom even told me that day, she's like, "Hey, I have a friend of mine coming over for dinner tonight, and I'd like for you to meet him. He's a really special friend," which was code for she had been dating him, obviously. And she had been dating him, and they met in the workplace. But I'll never forget, man, being 4 years old, this guy came walking in my house, and it's 1979. He's wearing this 3-piece suit. He was a white collar, data software engineer, 3-piece suit, double Windsor tie, trench coat, briefcase, the whole 9 yards. And comes walking in, shakes my hand. And the first question I asked this guy is, "Are you going to be my dad?" Literally, that was the first thing. It wasn't nice to meet you. It's, "Are you going to be my dad?" Because I thought my mom had found the dad. So I think my mom really kind of took that as a sign, and she ended up marrying him. And he ended up adopting me. I didn't know what that meant at the time, but all I knew is I had his last name, and we were a happy family. And, I don't think my mom actually ever really loved the guy, to be honest. I think she loved the idea of our family being complete. And I think she felt really compelled to have a dad for me. So I think that's really why she married him. And that all really kind of came to the surface because they had a very tumultuous, hard marriage, and they were only married for 6 years, and it was very toxic. There was a lot of alcohol involved. There was a lot of abuse involved, a lot of screaming, a lot of yelling. Cops were called to my house because of the neighbors. It was pretty bad. And, my dad was, if anybody ever asked about him, they'd be like, "Oh, that's one of the nicest guys in the world." And he was really nice until he drank. And then when he drank, he got pretty violent, pretty angry. And, my mom and him got divorced when I was 10, and I've never seen him since. And, that was pretty hard. You lose your dad. But at that point in my life, I realized, wait a second, this guy didn't come into my life till I was 4. Where did I come from? And I started asking questions. And that's when I found out my mom was actually married before, and I had no clue. And the fascinating thing that happened was my mom dated over the next couple of years. But at 12 years old, you and I were talking about the Florissant Civic Center, because right around where we grew up, I actually I began my relationship with my father, my biological father, at the Florissant Civic Center, because I basically had an opportunity to meet him, and I did. I met him there. And
how old were you then?
12.
12. Okay.
I was 12, and it was all by surprise. It was not planned. And, but anyway, he was remarried. He only lived 3 miles from us. I had no idea. And I don't know if my mom knew or not, but she never told me either way. But he was remarried at the time, had a 2-year-old son, another one on the way. And man, I was so excited. I was like, dude, this is my dad. Like we started hanging out. He started coming to my little league games. Like it was cool. And I was like, man, this is awesome. This is what it's all about. And I'll never forget, about 5 months into our relationship, my dad just started kind of like pulling away, or you could just tell something was pressing on him. And the best way I can describe it now, being an adult, and the way it felt is imagine that you're dating a woman and she's not into you anymore, but she hasn't told you yet, but it's coming. Like, it's coming. You can feel it. And that's what it felt like with him. And I'll never forget, one day I just picked up the phone and I'm like, hey man, like what's going on? Like, I feel like something's not right. And that's when he told me. He was like, it's me, it's not you. I can't really do this. I'm trying to start over. This is adding a lot of layers of complexity to my life and blah, blah, blah. And basically left again. And that was hard, man. I'm not going to lie. I fell into a really dark place as a kid. I failed the 8th grade. I actually had to do 8th grade twice. I overate, got really fat. My mom continued to date, several different types of guys. There were guys constantly in and out of our lives, and all of them were like the exact same dude, just different face, different name. Like, usually some alcohol, partiers, toxicity, abuse, that kind of thing. And then it really wasn't, I make my life sound like it was crazy, which it kind of was, but I did manage to turn it around. After I finished the 2nd year of 8th grade, I went on to high school, went on to college, got my degree, went on to a successful career in medical device sales. And then fast forward, 30 years old, married to my college sweetheart, first son on the way. I'm in a Starbucks here in St. Louis for a meeting with my team, for the company I worked with, and who comes walking in to get their morning coffee but my father. So I hadn't seen him. Yeah. I hadn't seen him since I was 12. And he came walking in, and one of the women that I was with on my sales team, like she knew, like she saw this look on my face, and she's like, "Are you all right? Like you look like you just seen a ghost." And I was like, "You're not gonna believe this." I was like, "But my father just walked in to get his morning coffee, I guess." And she's like, "I'm sorry, what?" And I was like, "Yeah, my dad and my father, like he's right over there." And she's like, "Is that the one you haven't seen since you were 12?" And I'm like, "Yep." And she goes, "What are you gonna say to him?" I was like, "Nothing. I'm not gonna say anything to him." She's like, "What is it? You're gonna just let him walk out of here?" I'm like, "Yeah." Yeah, that's the plan. And so without another word, she just got up from her seat, took it upon herself to walk right over to him. And I was like, oh my God, what is she doing? And she sat down next to him, started talking to him. And then all of a sudden my dad, like she told him, she's like, "Hey, I just want to let you know." And I didn't hear her say this. I just found out later. She said, "I want to let you know your oldest son is here. He's a great guy, and you would do well to get to know him." And he just came over and shook my hand and sat down, and he's like, "Hey," he's like, "My gosh, like, oh, how are you?" And I'm like, "Fine. Yeah. How are you?" Like, I wasn't a total jerk, but I wasn't kind either. I was kind of in between. I was sort of numb. And what I can tell you is that is now turned into, that was 17 years ago. And we've had a relationship now ever since. And it's been good. We've talked about somewhat of the past. We've let that go. My dad's 74 years old. He's a good guy. We get along just fine. But Dad Edge really got started was because, man, I desperately wanted to be a good father. And what I can tell you with all honesty is I was falling on my face as a father. I didn't start Dad Edge until my oldest was 6. And at the time, my youngest was 4. And it came out of a very dark place. And I'll finish up here with, because I know it's kind of a long story, but the book that you mentioned, The Pursuit of Legendary Fatherhood, when my publisher told me, they're like, "Hey, we need you to write, what the book's about on the back." And I was like, okay. And I wrote it, and my publisher was like, "We can't put this on the back of the book. We just can't." I'm like, "Well, that's what's going on the back." And the back of the book, and the guy the publishing house didn't understand it because the guy who owned it was not a dad, but the first sentence of the back of the book said, "10 years ago, I became the monster that I swore to protect my son against." And what happened is when my youngest at the time was 4, he's 14 now. He stepped out of line. I always swore to myself, because I was hit a lot growing up, that I would never hit my kids in anger. And my son stepped out of line, as any 4-year-old would, because that's what they're supposed to do. And I spanked him. And he lost his balance and he hit the ground. And I immediately was like, oh my God, like, what the hell did I just do? And I went to go pick him up, and he looked at me like I was a monster. He was terrified of me. And that was it. That was the line that was drawn. And I went into my office that night. I was very emotional, and I started what is now the Dad Edge, was then the Good Dad Project. And it just was a surrender, really, of like, I'm going to learn how to do this. I have no clue what I'm doing. I know what not to do, but that's not enough. And the final thing I'll say is this. There was something I realized that night. It was a horrible, dark moment, but I started looking at things that in my life that I was good at. I was good at my job. At the time, I was, good at martial arts, because I was taking martial arts, and I started really looking at just different things that I was good at, or just people in general were good at. And there's one common theme. If you're good at anything, you learn how to do it. And there's skills that are associated with it. There's training that you go through to be good at something. You don't just wing it. You just don't do it. And the funny thing is when it comes to marriage and when it comes to parenting, it's in our society that it's acceptable, and it's even a ding against you if you need extra help. Right. But in anything that we do, take a firefighter, a cop, a surgeon, whatever, there's a ridiculous amount of training that these people have to go through to do these jobs appropriately. But yet we don't do that in marriage or parenting. And that's where I was. And that's what the past 10 years have been.
Well, first and foremost, appreciate you saying that. And the purpose of my podcast is always to help people feel less alone, and then B, to encourage them to talk about it. And, you are one of a few gentlemen that we've had on this podcast over the last year who has had that moment, where they turned into the parent that they swore they would never become. They did one thing that scared their children, one thing that, where their kids looked at them and like they were a monster, and they knew right then and there that they had to make some serious changes. And I'm not immune to that either. I grew up with a father who drank a ton too, Larry. And, as a result, I found myself going down that exact same road of drinking way too much. And when my son was 6 months old, we were living in Denver, Colorado at the time. I went to a work function, got so wasted that when I came home, I couldn't help my wife with anything. I couldn't help my son, who was crying, and they were both exhausted. They were up all night. And, it was like that moment of clarity, like, you're headed down the same road unless you make a dramatic change. And the next morning I got up to write a letter to both my wife and son saying, I'll never touch alcohol again, which I haven't, right? December 15th, 2006 was the last time that I drank. But so many of us need to get to that moment where we kind of break a little, but then good on you for going, how do I fix it? Because you and I both know, Larry, there's a lot of people who experience the moment and then they just keep doing the behavior. They don't have the strength to lean into the new tools and learn the new training and all the things that you're talking about. So let's dive into this idea of creating an environment for kids to talk and tell you everything. I've got teenage sons now, myself, 16 and 14. They just don't do a lot of talking in general. And they're decent about communicating with us because I hope that I've laid some good foundational work. But, you talk about training, you talk about tools. What do you know about creating an environment for kids to share openly?
Quite a bit. I mean, we do some training on it. Actually, I just trained the guys in our mastermind on it this past week. You can actually manufacture psychological safety, and you can actually do it on a daily basis. And I'll give you the ways to do that. So I don't know how you were raised, or, the way I was raised. I think a lot of our generation was raised. And, here's the thing, like, I'm not trying to knock on, parents of our generation, but they only knew what they knew, and they were just doing how they just raised us the way they were raised, and they thought that was right. And I just remember, there's two types of kids, oh my God, this just happened. I need to call my dad. He'll know what to do, or he'll help me, or I just need to get this off my chest. And that's my go-to. And then you have the second kid is like, oh my God, this just happened. My parents can never find out. I will see a wrath, or this will happen, or that will happen. I will be shamed. I will have blame. I will have pain. I will have this. So it becomes like this environment where there are things, there are lies that are either told because you don't want to tell the truth as a kid, because you don't want to experience the shame or the guilt or the wrath, or you don't have that element, you don't have that environment of psychological safety. Or you can raise your kids where like, hey man, when things go wrong, this is where you land. Okay. And I'm not saying that there won't be a consequence, but it's going to be free from shame, guilt, blame. Like, listen, we make mistakes in this family. We welcome mistakes. We live by a quote in our family, and that is, your honesty and ownership is celebrated and not punished. And what I mean by that, and maybe this sounds way too light, but I will tell you, I'm playing this game for the long game. And what I mean by that is, when my kids own something, right? When they own something and they admit something, or they're honest about something, my response is, thank you. I'm sure that took a ton of courage for you to tell me that. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that if my son tells me, hey, I shoplifted, that there isn't going to be some natural consequences around that. But if he lies to me and I find out about it, then there's going to be natural consequences, and then there's going to be consequences on top of that as well. But if he's honest with me and tells me like, hey, this happened, I'd be like, well, hey, you know what? Thank you for telling me that. That's a lot of courage. That's, it's obviously disappointing to hear. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about your thought process through this, maybe why you did it, what was going on. And there's going to be some natural consequences. Let's go up to the store. Let's make this right. Let's talk to the owner. Let's pay for it. Let's do this. Let's do that. Whatever that looks like. But the way that you manufacture psychological safety is in your responses with your kids.
Yes.
And one way to do that, I ask my kids 3 questions almost every day. Some days I'm not good at it, but most days I am. The first question is, what was a high point moment for you? Or what was something fantastic that happened today? Or what was something that brought you joy today? I love that question way more than how was your day?
Right. Yeah, right.
You don't get any depth out of that question. But the second question is where you can really manufacture psychological safety. And I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example of what I used to do, and I think a lot of parents still do to this day, and what you can do to reverse it. So I asked my kids, what did you fail at today? Or what's something that challenged you today? Or how did you fall flat on your face today and recover? And here's what I'll hear. Oh, Dad, like, I got that science test back. Man, I got a D on it. Now, here's how you handle it improperly. What do you mean you got a D on it? Didn't I tell you to study for that test? Like, dude, come on, you know better than this. We don't get D's in this family, man. Like we do our best, and that's not your best. And I go downstairs, I see you on your phone. I know you're not studying. Like, what is it going to take, man? Now, do you think that kid is going to want to tell me anything? No. He's making a mental note, right? Okay, note to self, don't tell dad bad stuff. So instead, what I do, I'm always extremely prepared and vigilant that something is going to come my way it could shock me. And so when my son tells me I got a D on the science test, oh, okay, well, tell me more about that. I specifically say, tell me more about that. I don't say why. The 3-letter word why will actually subconsciously put anybody, including our kids, on the defense. If I say, hey, why did you do that? Or why did you get a D? I'm automatically subconsciously putting him in a defense mode. And he's already feeling shame and guilt, and he's cowering a little bit, right? Not physically, but maybe mentally and emotionally. But if I say, oh, tell me more about that. Tell me more about that is you are going to get the why. But tell me more about that is the invite. Tell me more about that. And then it'll be like, yeah, like I studied, I guess I didn't study well enough, and blah, blah. Okay, well, let me ask this. If you were to have a second shot at this test and you could do something over again, what would you do different? It's like, oh, you know what? I really didn't study as hard as I probably should have. I should have studied probably the night before. I studied one time the whole week. That obviously wasn't enough. Well, man, that is great information to have, right? So when's your next test? Well, my next test is next Friday. Okay, great. Well, based on the information that you have and some of the things that you've already said that you would do different, what would you do different getting ready for this next test? Like, well, I probably study every night before the test. Man, I think that's a great idea. Like, how can I support you in that? Do you want me to help you? Do you want me to hold you accountable? Like, what feels best to you? I also like using those words, what feels best, because kids are feeling people, right?
Right.
I would say us as grown men, we're more like logical people, right? But kids and wives, psychological safety, what feels best to you? Because what I'm digging in there is, well, hey man, like what feels best to you, right? I'm getting into his emotion. Man, Dad, if you could just hold me accountable, just make sure I'm doing it. Or like, hey, would you mind quizzing me the night before the test? Man, I'm down. Heck yeah, I got your back. Let's do this. Now, what I just did was I didn't have to lecture him one bit. All I did was ask him questions for him to provide his own solution. I did it with a welcoming, inviting voice tone. I used words. I avoided words like why. I used phrases like tell me more about that. And all the questions, none of the questions were around shame. Like, what were you thinking? What were you doing? It was all about like, hey, how do we make this right in the future? What did we learn from it? Right now, what I can tell you is I have 2 teenage sons. I have 2 little sons too. I have 4 total. I'm not saying this to brag, but my teenage boys will tell me things that I sit there and I almost like whip my head around. Like, I can't believe they just told me that. and I'm like, these kids have got so much courage, or they must feel so comfortable. I would have never said this to my mom or dad growing up, but they do. But I think a lot of it is that it's like those daily reps, right? They experience that safe haven where they can come talk to you. And the final thing I'll say is this: when it comes to psychological safety, and the reason that I say your ownership and honesty is celebrated, not punished, is because I'm playing this for the long game, man. Like, listen, my 6-year-old, I was in a music store last night and he shoplifted a guitar pick. And I was like, and I was mad. And, and he opens up his hand. He's like, oh, look, it must have just fell in my hand. And I'm like, and I looked at him and I was pissed. And I go, really? I was like, I was like, Colton, is that what happened? And he's like, and he looked at it. I was like, why don't you tell Dad what really happened? And he's like, I took this. And I'm like, okay. I was like, well, thanks for telling me. What do you think we need to do to make this right? He's like, I think we should go back and give it back. I was like, I think that's a great idea. Let's go do that. And then I looked at him kind of sternly. Like I didn't beat him down or anything. I was like, hey, listen, man, we don't steal. Hagners don't steal. Like, we buy things. We don't steal things. Can you agree to that? And he's like, I can agree to that. I was like, okay. Now, when they're 6 years old like that, those are the little things. It's like the little white lies, the dishonesty or whatever, right? But when they're teenagers, it's drugs, it's alcohol, it's I'm having sex with this girl, right? That's the long game. Those are the conversations that I really want to be a part of. And when things go bad in their lives, when they're young adults like that, I want them to feel good about coming to mom and dad.
Super solid, man. Everything you're saying is extraordinary. I talk a lot about on this podcast the parent. It's called Love and Logic. It's parenting. Have you heard about it? Right?
Yeah. It's great.
So it's a dynamite philosophy, and it really, like what you just said there toward the end, sort of sums it up. I mean, the Love and Logic idea is that the cost is always cheaper now, and you just articulated that beautifully. At 6 years old, it's a guitar pick. At 16, it's drugs or alcohol. At 26, it's a DUI. Like it just keeps going up, and there's really good reasons to nip it in the bud, as they say, and tend to it now, but in a meaningful way where you don't beat them down, you don't make them feel worse. What do you say? Let me ask you a question and just kind of play devil's advocate a little bit. How do you handle men who just don't do great with their words? They're not really awesome with their emotions. And, if their son were to, steal a guitar pick, like the switch would just flip for them. And they don't have that capacity to walk through it in a mindful way like you do. How do you help that group of men?
Well, first of all, I think you have to, listen, I mean, I think we just need to recognize the human nature. Like when my 6-year-old told me last night that he stole a guitar pick and he kind of lied about it on top of it, man, I was pissed. And there was a part of me that was just like, dude, what are you thinking, man? Right. And I have to fight against that. And there's a part of me, man, like, it's like, if I want this kid to learn, man, I need to get in his face a little bit. Right. And I think kids do learn, right? I do think that is somewhat effective if you do that. They're like, okay, I've just learned two things. I will never steal again because I just saw how mad my dad got. And I also just learned that I'm going to be really choosy about what I tell my dad. Like, those are the lessons that I think you're really teaching there.
Amen.
But I think when you can zoom out though a little bit, right? And really understand, like, okay, if you're reacting, in this vicious mode where you're just coming down on your kids with tons of guilt and shame and all this other stuff, and you're creating this environment where you're like, dude, if you tell me that you did something bad, God freaking help you. You're playing the short game. You're not playing the long game. You have to be very, very strategic, and you have to be even more of a creative thinker, and you have to be a really good a good guy with a good, you have to have good questioning skills, right?
Yeah, right.
To get them to more solution-based thinking. Most people don't have that. So when there's a wrongdoing, like, so for instance, my son, let me explain this a little bit. When my son told me I stole, my first reaction is like, what am I doing wrong that you think that this is okay? So then it kind of,
sure, you make it about you, right away.
Which makes me even more angry, right? Like, what am I doing wrong? Like, what am I missing here? Like, what were you thinking, right? And I also do not want my son to grow up thinking stealing is okay. So I'm going to get angry, and I'm going to get in his face a little bit, and I'm going to apply some pain, right? But I also know that when he's 8 and he makes another mistake, he's saying to himself, I will not tell my dad this. There's no way. And that's not the relationship that I want long-term. What I want long-term is for him to process, like, hey, what happened here? Why did this happen? How do we make it right? How do we avoid it in the future? And if I know the questions to ask, and I know the tonality of my voice to get him there, then I'm playing the long game. Like, listen, my son was plenty disappointed in himself. I could see it in his face last night that he was really ashamed at what he did, especially when he knew, when he knew that I knew. I didn't really have to apply much more pain. He already felt it. But I want him to come back to me when something goes wrong again.
I like to tell people all the time after my retreat, one of the things that I picked up on. So let's talk about anger really quick, because as it pertains to men, that's kind of one of the driving forces. For dudes, it seems to be like, that's where we go. That's where we go in almost everything in life. If something doesn't go our way, we just get angry. I mean, we're literally children. It's so funny when you think about it. But, anger is useful in that if somebody has broken a rule and there's a clear right and a clear wrong, like, you're good. You're supposed to be a little angry about that. That's supposed to bother you a little bit, but it's what you do with the anger and the tools that you probably apply to it that differentiate, those who are kind of getting it right from those who kind of continue to get it wrong. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would totally agree with that.
I think it's important to talk about, because there's a lot of people out there right now that think that the world is getting too soft and this is happening and that is happening. And I don't think anybody's here suggesting that you should never get angry again. I don't think anybody's suggesting that you should even be, more gentle and relax the rules with our children. But I just love what you're saying about language, because Larry, you don't know this about me, or maybe you do, but for 27 years, I was a radio personality. And so that I had to use my words. My words were my communication. And I know for a fact that most people struggle with communication. Most people don't know how to ask good questions. Most people aren't very good listeners. And that's a really great thing to kind of learn, because just knowing how to listen a little bit and ask some better questions, I believe, kind of changes the dynamic of most relationships. And so let's transition now for the last 10, 15 minutes of this podcast into creating an extraordinary marriage. We've talked about how to create this environment where your kids feel safe and they want to talk to you. How do we do something similar with regards to our wives and our spouses?
Yeah, so great question. I think what's really, really important to know and just important to recognize, and it just is what it is that men and women are freaking different, man. Right? We're different human beings. And let me give you an example. And this is the way we communicate. Now listen, if I'm going to vent to you, Matt, like, I'm not looking to just vent. I am venting to you because I am sharing with you what's going on in my life. And I want you to tell me what you think I should do. Like, hey man, how do I fix this? Right. Otherwise I'm not going to waste my breath telling you what's going on. Right. I just tell you everything's fine. But if I'm really like leaning in and like, hey, this is going on, it's because I want you to lean back and tell me, like, what is it you see? What is it I don't see? What should I do about this? And that's really important to understand. Women, on the other hand, sometimes they do that, but I would say 80% of the time, the reason that they're venting or talking or whatever, or communicating with you in any way, is because all she wants to do is connect with you, right? And then when we start going into Mr. Fix-It mode and problem-solving mode, that comes from such a noble place in men. I want women to really understand that. Is that when your man starts giving you advisement on what you should do about something, it's because he doesn't want you to be in pain, right? He doesn't want you to feel pain or stress or anything else. So the easiest way to do that is, let me help you take away this pain and help you fix the problem. But the way women view that is like, are you not hearing me? Do you not trust me to figure this out on my own? Like, why are you telling me what you think I should do? This is kind of condescending. It doesn't really feel good to me. Instead, the best thing to do when you're communicating with your wife is to simply, and I know this sounds way too easy, simply label what it is that you think she's feeling. So like, for instance, if I come home and I'll use, how was your day? Because it's a terrible question, but everybody uses it. And your wife is like, oh my God, today was crazy. Like, this happened. I forgot to pay this bill. We have a late fee. And then the dishwasher broke. And then Colton spilled his milk all over the place. And like, it was kind of a lot going on. Now, here's the thing. The old me would have done a couple of different things. This makes me sound like a jerk, but I would have either said like, well, that doesn't sound too bad. Like, we can get the dishwasher fixed. That's no big deal. And like the bill, like, it's no big deal. We'll pay the late fee. We'll be fine. And Colton, yeah, he probably needs to go in timeout or something, or clean up the floor, and that's demeaning to her, right? She's like, man, like, did you even hear me? And plus what I also did is I didn't even validate what she's feeling. In fact, I was like, that doesn't sound like such a big deal. Right. Well, what I'm trying to do is give her perspective from my man perspective. Right. That doesn't sound like a big deal. Just calm down. We'll be fine. Right. And instead, she's like, God bless. That doesn't feel right. Instead, what I do now is I just simply label what it is I think that she's feeling. And then I normalize it. So I'm like, yeah, that sounds overwhelming. Who wouldn't be overwhelmed? Tell me more about what happened. So again, I labeled her emotion with overwhelmed. I normalized it by saying, who wouldn't be overwhelmed? That seems like a lot. Tell me more about that, versus why did that happen? Or just the word why in general. Tell me more about that, which is inviting her to tell me more. And then if I want more information, I stay away from the word why. I use a skill set that we talk about a lot called mirroring, which is you're just basically repeating like the last 3 words that she said. If she's like, oh my God, today was so overwhelming, I'd be like, today was so overwhelming, or today was overwhelming. And when I say it like that, like in a curiosity tone where I'm inviting her to tell me more, just by me mirroring those last 3 words, the message I'm sending my wife is, I heard every word that you said, so much so that I'm using your words. And when you mirror somebody, it automatically lands, that person heard me, and they're going to tell you more, because that's basically, you're triggering the same thing as if you were to ask them why. But mirroring is way more powerful. It's way more, it's way more effective with connecting with your wife, and really stating that you heard every word. And here's the other thing too, when you're using just those 2 skill sets alone, you become an insanely good listener. Like, your mind is not rattled or sidetracked of how am I going to tell her to solve this, or how can I take away this pain, or, you're listening to every single word that she's saying because you're looking for emotion and you're looking for words. So a byproduct of this is you become a really great listener as well, which, by the way, she feels it when you're listening.
As we wrap up, Larry, I really have enjoyed this conversation quite a bit, because I'm into practical applications with this kind of thing. Most folks, when you interview them, they speak in these broad strokes, but you've given us some really tangible ways to actually be a better spouse, to actually be a better dad. I want to wrap up by talking about intimacy. Sure. It is one of the things in marriage that can be a volatile situation. I don't know what your experience is, but I tend to meet more people who have whose sex or intimacy is more of a stressor in their marriage than money. And money's usually the biggest one. But, at least in my space, I'm meeting a lot of people now where intimacy is the issue that they face. They're fine financially. Do you feel that way? Do you feel like you're running into a lot of men who are struggling with intimacy too?
Constantly. And that's why I say, and I think this will give men some relief. Listen, if you don't know how to build intimacy with your wife, that's really okay. It's not like we take classes on that. It's not like we take training on that, right? In fact, what we do is we're just like, well, I love her, so this should all come naturally. Like, there's a lot of things that I love. I love to cook, but that doesn't mean that I always do it right. Now, if I'm trained on how to cook like a perfect filet mignon and I YouTube it and I literally learn the skill to make that perfect steak, then I can go execute that skill and have the outcome that I want. Well, guess what? Building and creating intimacy with your wife is no different. It is absolutely, positively no different. And what a lot of men and women feel when it comes to marriage is like, well, these are just feelings. They're not. You have to come to the table with skills. So like, for instance, if I want to build intimacy with my wife, I'm going to talk to her and I'm going to hang on her. I've known my wife for 26 years. I've been married to her for 19 years. We have an unbelievable marriage. I'm a very lucky guy, but luck has had very little to do with it because this has become a study for me. And so if I want to build intimacy with my wife, which I want to every day, right? Intimacy is not just about sex or anything like that. It's about this closeness and connection that we have. Then when we talk, I'm going to give her my undivided attention. I'm going to look to label her emotions. I'm going to mirror her. I'm going to talk to her. I'm going to hang on her every word. I'm going to come to conversations without expectation and agenda. I'm going to come to conversations with curiosity and appreciation. I'm going to create this environment of psychological safety with my wife. I'm going to ask my wife another skill set, generative questions. If you're asking, one thing I can tell you, you and your listeners, I mean, obviously not you, but your listeners, is if you're asking your wife and kids, how was your day? Please stop doing that. You can reframe questions that are going to create intimacy and connection with your wife and kids. And obviously that intimacy is very different between wife and kids. But like, if I go to my wife and I say, hey, tell me something that made you smile today. And then I listen and hang on her every word. And I label her emotions like, oh my gosh, like that sounds amazing. Like that must've felt amazing. Yeah, it did feel amazing. Like, dude, that's intimacy. That's connection, right? But if I go into my default mode, which I do every now and again, I'm like, how was your day? And she tells me, oh, it was good. Okay, cool. We just move on to the next, or we just completely go on autopilot. That doesn't build any intimacy. So get really good at being creative with these skills. The last and final thing I'll say is like, a lot of couples will say, well, we used to have intimacy, or we used to be so in love, or we used to do this, or we used to do that. It's just not there anymore. What I will this is where I challenge men. I'm like, I was like, tell me about your first date with your wife. And they'll light up and they're like, oh, we did this and we did that. And I was, do you remember what she wore? Yeah, actually I do. She wore like these really killer jeans and this cool shirt and this and that. And I was like, what kind of questions did you ask her? Oh man, I asked her about her childhood and I asked her about her faith and what she wanted to do for a living, where she saw herself in 5 years, like all these different questions. I was like, when was the last time you got curious and asked your wife different questions like that? Mm-hmm. And then you'll see it. They're like, I don't. Well, guess what? If you do the things that you did in the beginning in the relationship won't have an end. And I'm sitting here 26 years later. I still ask my wife these incredible questions. Like one of the questions I just asked her was, if you and I were sitting out on our deck 20 years from now, and we had a glass of wine in our hand and we cheers to an amazing life that we had, what are we celebrating that happened over the last 20 years that hasn't happened yet? And things like that, where you're like, and the reason that that's called a generative question is because it generates connection. It generates intimacy. It generates vision and ideas and things that we can do together. And she's generating those ideas with me. So of course, like when she's envisioning that stuff, she's like, oh my God, like I could see us. I really, really want to go to Hawaii. Oh my gosh, that would be so amazing if we went to Hawaii together. Well, now my wife is envisioning us in Hawaii and she's telling me about it and she's excited about it. I'm sharing in that excitement with her. I mean, how can you not have intimacy when you have conversations like that?
It's awesome, man. Everything this guy has been saying, I hope that all men put into practice. And notice I said practice because it's going to take a little bit of time. All of these changes, any new tool you use and put in, there's a little learning curve, like you mentioned. There's a little point there where it's a touch unnatural, but push through that, fight through that, because what's waiting for on the other side is pretty good. The book will be out soon, called The Pursuit of Legendary Fatherhood, which I think I'm going to have to pick that up, man. It looks like you've got your pulse on where people are right now. You've got your pulse on the shift that so many fathers are trying to make right now, which is to move into a little bit more of a sensitive space with regard to, how we just want to be a little less macho and a little bit more feelings. And I can get down with that. Anything you want to leave people with that we haven't covered yet today?
Yeah, I would say and this is going to sound really self-serving, but it's the truth. Men will live this quiet life of desperation and isolation, and they take some of their best ideas and they leave a lot of their, what I call, living a legendary life on the table. And the way to do that is, physically we're surrounded by people. We're surrounded by other men, right? Mentally and emotionally, we don't let other good men into our lives. Here's a fascinating thing too, Matthew. If you ever go to a family get together where there's other friends, right, of yours that are couples, right? Maybe it's a kid's birthday or whatever. Watch the men and watch their body language. What we do is we hold our beverage or beer or whatever we're drinking, and we hold it in front of our chest. We're literally saying to the world, I'm guarded. Everything is fine, or it's good, or it's busy. Those are our three favorite words. That's how we answer every single question. However, I will tell you that when you have good men in your life, right? Not just in your life, I'm talking in your life, the ones who are just hey man, how are things with you and Jessica? You guys going on date nights? Are you talking? How's your intimacy? How's the relationship with your teenagers? How's that going? Tell me about it. Are you spending time with them? Do you know who their friends are? Are you having conversations around sex and drugs and all this other stuff? Those are the kind of conversations. These are the type of men that men need in their lives in order to navigate this whole thing so much better, so much more efficiently and effectively. And I think we leave a lot on the table when we don't let other good men into our lives. So if you don't have that tribe or that crew, my advice is go out and find them. They're either you can join a mastermind, go find them in your church, friends of yours that maybe you grew up with, that you had a really tight relationship, maybe you haven't talked to in a while. Those guys need it too. So go out and make sure you have these relationships. It's only going to make your life better.
We have 3 goals with Learn from People Who Lived It. 1, to help you feel less alone. 2, encourage you to seek out a coach, a therapist, a church, anyone who can help you get through your journey and find some healing. 3, when you're ready, share your story with us.
Find Learn from People Who Lived It wherever you get podcast. Search it using all one word. Learn from People Who Lived It.
Well, for those that are still hanging out, thanks for listening to this episode of Learn from People Who Lived It. Coming up, we've got a conversation with dope black dads. We're going to bring in Eric Tivers. We've got an amazing woman who's going to stop by, who had her entire world changed in 12 seconds. She experienced an earthquake that took nearly her entire family. Her story is unbelievably inspirational. These are all things on the way right here on Learn from People Who Lived It. I'm Matthew Blades, the host, reminding you to subscribe, and if you wouldn't mind, leave a review. We certainly do appreciate that, and I hope that you are passing along this podcast, most importantly to friends, and reminding them that they can jump in wherever they want. Just check the show notes, look for a story that resonates with you, and boom, start right there. Have a great day.